I woke face down on wet sand with no memory of swimming, which meant the sea had decided to keep me by accident. It was first light. Salt crust had dried tight across my skin like a second layer. I didn't remember swimming. The last thing I had was the deck tilting under my feet, the lights going out, the cold coming in. The ferry was called the Mindoro Star, an overnight inter-island crossing, the kind that should have been routine. It had gone down in a storm sometime in the dark. The night had thinned to a sliver of dawn, and there was nothing ahead of me but water and nothing behind me but treeline. No shouts, no movement, no one. I sat up and took stock of myself first, the way you check a shipment before you sign for it. A gash on my forearm from something sharp in the dark. Both shoes gone. Ribs sore where I had taken an impact, but nothing grinding, nothing broken that I could feel. Alive, the body didn't say for how long. I called out once. My voice came back at me, swallowed flat by the open air, and nothing answered but the tide, water sliding up the sand and pulling away again with a low hiss. I got to my feet slowly and tested my balance. My left ankle was wobbly where I had wrenched it in the surf, but it held. I looked again, and the second look told me the same thing the first one had. No other survivors, no wreckage near the shore, just a long curve of pale sand and a wall of dark green trees. I had spent 11 years moving other people's cargo across these waters. I knew exactly how empty this stretch of ocean was, no ships passing in the night, no planes overhead in the day. A long way from anywhere, and no one out here but me. I started toward the treeline before the sun got high, leaving footprints the next tide would take back. By mid-morning, I had walked the beach twice and made a list, because a list was the only tool I had that still worked. I went along the tide line with my feet sinking into the wet sand, scanning the debris that had washed up above the high water mark. There wasn't much, and most of it was useless. A cracked plastic cooler, lid ajar but the shell intact. A coil of nylon rope, maybe 20 meters, an orange life vest, a child's flip-flop I decided not to think about, and half-buried, a sealed half-bottle of water. I dragged the cooler up past the high tide line and laid the rest out beside it in a row, because laying things out in a row is how I keep my hands steady. The rope was the prize shelter lashings, a fishing line if it came to that. The vest was too small to be warm, but would float me if I ever had to leave the beach. The flip-flop served no purpose except the one I wouldn't look at. The water I rationed the way I had rationed pallet space my whole career. I cracked the seal and tipped it over my tongue. 3 small sips, cap back on, the rest had to last the day. It was while I was counting, cooler, rope, vest, half a bottle, that the real shape of it landed. This was not a wait-by-the-phone situation I could schedule around. There was no signal out here, and my phone had not survived to find out. I checked the debris one more time, and then I caught myself looking for a manifest, some slip taped to the cooler telling me what I had received and who to sign for it. There wasn't one, of course. I almost laughed. The sun climbed and started down again. By late afternoon, the shadows had stretched long, and the first real fear arrived with the cooling air, the night, the cold, and no way yet to make fire. The window arrived at dusk, and my first clear thought was that this was what the end felt like, the brain handing out mercies on the way down. I was leaning against the cracked cooler with the cold working into my wet clothes, watching the sky go orange and then gray. I was tired enough and dry enough on the inside that when the text appeared in the corner of my vision, I assumed it was the start of something the body does when it is giving up. Welcome, survivor. I stared at it. It didn't waver and it didn't fade. It hung there, bright against the darkening sky, the way a notification sits on a phone, except there was no phone. Daily sign-in system initialized. I blinked hard, the way you blink to clear a smudge. The words stayed exactly where they were. Sign in once per day to claim provisions. Miss a day and your streak resets to 0. I read it the way I read a shipping contract, slowly, looking for the clause that costs you. Then I read it again, because I am the kind of man who reads the instructions before he opens the box. It was the most important box I had ever been handed. Daily sign-in available, Sign in now. I read it a third time, in case the third reading would be the one that changed it. It didn't change. When I let my focus settle on a line, the line brightened. It was tracking my eyes. Not a phone, not a dream I could blink away. There was a catch in it somewhere, there always is. The streak, the missed day, the reset, a penalty clause whose full shape I couldn't see yet. But it was dusk, and it was getting cold, and the alternative to signing was the night and no fire. I already knew what I was going to do. I focused on the prompt and thought, as deliberately as I had ever thought anything, yes. The window brightened, held a beat, and accepted it the way a touchscreen accepts a tap. No flash, no light. The prompt simply dimmed and folded itself back into the corner of my eye. 11 feet down the sand, a crate was suddenly there. Grey hardshell, weatherproof, latched, the exact kind of freight case I had signed for 10,000 times across 11 years. I crossed to it on unsteady legs. There was no slip on the lid, no paperwork tucked under the handle, and before I could stop myself, I had checked underneath for one out of pure habit. The first shipment in my entire career to arrive early. I worked the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, packed neat and tight the way a good handler packs, a thermal blanket folded into a square, a fixed blade knife sheathed beside it, a ferro rod fire starter, sealed pouches of water, and dry rations stamped with a week's worth of days. Sign-in day 1 complete. Reward, thermal blanket, fixed blade knife, ferro rod fire starter, 4L purified water, 7-day dry rations. I did not shout, and I did not thank the sky. I did the next practical thing, which felt better than either would have. I gathered driftwood, the dry pieces from above the tide line, and built it small and tight the way a fire wants to be built. Then I took the ferro rod and scraped it down hard over a nest of dry grass. It caught on the third try. The flame took, spread to the kindling, and steadied. I fed it up in stages until it threw real heat, and then I pulled the thermal blanket around my shoulders. It was dry and it was clean, and after a full day in clothes stiff with seawater, dry and clean, was the best thing I had felt in longer than I wanted to count. By full dark I had a fire, 4 liters of water, 7 days of food, and a blanket, which was 4 more useful things than I had owned that morning. I sat close to the flames with a pouch of water in one hand, and for the first time an inventory worth counting. So I counted it, 1 blanket, 1 knife, 1 fire, 4 liters, 7 days, and this time the counting was not a way to keep myself calm. It was just true. The window had gone small in the corner of my vision. When I let my focus drift to it, it brightened and showed me where the day had left me. Streak 1 day. Next sign-in available in 18:00:00. A clock under the streak count was already ticking down. 18 hours. Whatever this was, it did not end at sunset. It carried into tomorrow and the day after that. Below the clock there was a line I had not seen before. Tier 1 provisions unlocked. Reach a 7-day streak to unlock Tier 2 shelter. I read it twice, and the shape of the thing finally came clear. This was not a rescue, it was a build. Provisions today, shelter at 7 days, and the line implied without quite saying more after that, tier on tier, as long as I kept the streak. The catch was the one I had already guessed. Miss a single day and it all went back to 0. I had never once in my life missed a shipping deadline. I looked at my hands, rough from years of crates and cargo, and at the knife resting on the sand with the firelight moving along the blade. A beach, when you got right down to it, was only a warehouse nobody had organized yet. I put another piece of driftwood on the fire and watched the countdown tick down in the corner of my eye. 18 hours until the next sign-in. I had food, water, a blade, and a flame, and a promise from something I did not understand that tomorrow there would be more. The tide came in and went out and did not touch me. For the first time since the deck went dark, I was warm and dry and counting things I actually had. I was going to sign in every single day. I was going to make this beach unrecognizable. On the morning of the second day, the countdown in the corner of my eye reached 0, and the window changed by itself. I crawled out from under the lean-to stiff and cold, the ashes of last night's fire gone grey beside me, The salt dried tight on my skin again overnight. I had slept badly, and I was alive, and on the island those two facts had stopped cancelling each other out. The window was waiting. Daily sign-in available, sign in now. I focused on it and thought yes, the way I had on the first night, and it took the thought the way a touchscreen takes a tap. Sign in day 2 complete. Streak 2 days. Another day, another box. The grey case had come down further along the beach this time, sitting inert on the sand exactly where the system had decided to set it. I did not run to it. The deliveries were reliable, and a man does not sprint to meet a pallet he already knows is his. I walked down at a steady pace and worked the latches. Inside, a fresh thermal blanket, more sealed water, dry rations, a machete in a canvas sheath, and a small coil of fishing line. I turned the line over in my hand and read it as a hint. The system gave me what it had decided I would need next, and it had decided I would need to start feeding myself. I carried the case up above the tide line and laid the contents out beside the day before's, in a row, because a row is how I keep my hands steady and my count honest. 2 days behind me, one streak intact. Then I went to find out how the rest of it worked. I spent the next hour doing to the window what I would have done to any new system at work. I tested it until it told me its rules. I let my focus settle on the streak line, and it brightened and volunteered more, the way a good manifest answers the question you actually asked. Current streak, 2 days. Tier 2 shelter unlocks at a 7-day streak. So there was a ladder, and 7 days bought the next rung. I pushed at the edges of it. Could I sign in late in the day instead of at dawn? Could I let the gesture wait? I held the questions in my head, and the system, as if it could read the shape of the worry, answered the one that mattered. Sign-in window opens once per 24-hour cycle. Miss the cycle, and the streak resets to 0. There it was, as plain as the operating rules of any warehouse I had ever run. The window opened once a cycle. Inside the cycle I had latitude. Across the boundary of it, I had none, miss a single day, and the whole ladder dropped to the ground, and I started the climb again from nothing. I sat with that. I had spent 11 years living and dying by delivery windows, and I knew exactly how one missed window cascades down a whole schedule. This was the same arithmetic, with my life in the place where the freight usually went. Do not miss a day. I said it out loud once to set it, the way I used to read a critical instruction back to confirm it had landed. The island had handed me a rule simple enough to live by and unforgiving enough to die by, and being good at exactly that kind of rule was the one thing 11 years had left me genuinely good at. The machete came in the day 2 case, and that was the thing that finally got me off the beach. I had circled the sand for 2 days like a man afraid to leave the loading dock. With a blade in my hand, I finally pushed past the tree line, marking my way as I went, a notch here, a bent branch there, the way you label a route you mean to run again. The interior was another country. The light went green and close under the canopy, the air cooler and thick, with the smell of wet earth and growing things, and birds I could not name arguing somewhere overhead. I went slowly, the machete loose in my hand, more careful than the quiet seemed to ask for. After the better part of an hour, the ground tilted down, and I heard it before I saw it. A thin trickle of fresh water running over rock into a clear pool. I crouched and drank from my cupped hands. It was sweet and cold and real, and I sat back on my heels and let the size of it land. Water that did not come out of a sealed pouch. Water that would be here tomorrow whether or not the window opened. It was the most important line on the inventory. A man can ration food a long time. Water is the one that kills you in days, and I had just found my own. I filled the steel pot and carried it back along my marked trail, and I grinned the whole way, which was a thing my face had half forgotten how to do. By the 3rd day, I had stopped thinking of it as a beach I was stuck on and started thinking of it as a site I had to lay out. I moved everything above the high tide line into one place, the cooler, the gear, the water, close to the trail that ran inland to the pool, and I laid it out the way I would have laid out a warehouse floor, what I used most, nearest to hand, what I used least, back and dry. Then I signed in for the third day. Sign in day 3 complete. Reward, folding saw, hatchet, 50 paracord, 2 tarpaulins, work gloves. The case opened on tools, not provisions, a folding saw, a hatchet, 50 meters of paracord, 2 heavy tarpaulins, a pair of work gloves. I ran a hand over them and read the message as clearly as a packing slip. The system had stopped equipping me to survive the day and started equipping me to build. Whatever was coming at the 7-day mark, it expected me to have raised something to put it in. Streak 3 days. I pulled the gloves on. They fit. I did not let myself read too much into a pair of gloves fitting, but I noticed it, the way I had started noticing everything the island handed me. 3 days. The counter in the corner of my eye said 3 days, and I sat with it the way I used to sit with a delivery schedule. I checked my supplies again at dusk and counted them out loud out of the old reflex: 1 knife, 1 blanket, 1 ferro rod, a saw and a hatchet, 4 liters of water, and the pool besides. The count came out good. 3 days behind me on the ladder and tier 2 ahead. 4 more sign-ins to tier 2. I turned the number over the way I would once have turned over a lead time. 4 more cycles of not missing, and the window would hand me a roof. I could do 4 days standing on my head after 11 years of hitting harder deadlines for people who never thanked me for them. Then I looked up, and the weather was on the horizon. The wind had backed around onshore cooler, carrying a thickness in it that meant water. Far out over the water, a bank of cloud was massing that I did not like, too tall, too dark, sitting where it had no business sitting. I had moved enough freight through enough monsoon seasons to read a sky, and that sky was telling me something was coming, and that I had days at most before it got here. The arithmetic rearranged itself in my head: 4 days to a roof, maybe fewer than 4 before the weather. I did not love the way those 2 numbers lined up. I banked the fire for the night and looked once more at the cloud out past the reef. 3 days behind me, 4 to go. I had a knife, a saw, 2 tarps, and a streak I did not intend to break, and somewhere out there the weather was deciding what to do about me. I would get my roof up first. I had 4 days, and I had never needed more than a deadline to get something built. Days 4, 5, and 6 went the way good days go when you have a deadline: fast and the same. I signed in each morning, banked what the window gave me, and spent the daylight clearing a build site up the short trail near the treeline close to the pool. I cut back the undergrowth with the machete, leveled the ground, and dragged usable wreck timber up from the beach a length at a time. It was hard, plain work, and I was grateful for it, work I could measure, with an end I could see. The cloud bank still sat offshore. It did not come in, and it did not leave. I checked it the way I used to check a delayed shipment alert, a dozen times a day, hoping the status would change and knowing it wouldn't until it did all at once. Streak 6 days. 1 more sign-in to tier 2. On the morning of the 7th day, the counter ticked to 7, and for the first time, the window gave me something I had not seen before. Sign-in day 7 complete. Streak 7 days. Tier 2 shelter unlocked. Reward: dimensional timber, weatherproof tarpaulin, hammer, nails, lashing kit. I read it twice. The system had not just stocked me, it had moved me up a rung. A larger crate had come down on the sand, and a second beside it. I worked the latches and found in the first, dimensional timber cut to manageable lengths, a hammer, a box of rust-resistant nails, a lashing kit. In the second, a weatherproof tarpaulin nearly as long as I was tall, heavy enough to throw rain off and not tear. I did not celebrate. I crouched by the crates and sized the materials up the way I'd size up a pallet I had to turn into a loaded truck by end of shift, counting lengths, planning cuts, seeing the thing finished before I'd started it. Tier 3 Self-Sufficiency unlocks at a 14-day streak. Another rung, named and waiting. I filed it and let it go. Tier 3 was a week off. The storm was not. I had built a lot of things on paper in 11 years, and almost nothing with my hands, and it turned out the hands remembered more than I expected. I built it once, and I built it right. First, a raised platform off the damp ground, driftwood logs for footings, the dimensional timber decked across them, up out of the wet. Then 4 corner posts, set plumb and lashed and nailed, and crossbeams to tie them into a frame that did not rack when I leaned my weight on it. I notched where notching held better than nails and lashed where lashing held better than both, the paracord biting down tight. The tarpaulin went over the top last, pitched on a ridgeline so the rain would run off and not pool, stretched taut and tied down hard along every edge. I walled 3 sides to shoulder height with timber and salvaged debris, palm fronds and coconut husk packed into the gaps, and left the 4th side as a doorway I could close with a hung flap of tarp. The clouds thickened as I worked. The wind came up off the sea carrying the smell of rain, and under it, the first far mutter of thunder. I worked through the afternoon with the weather watching me, and by dusk, I had a structure that would keep the rain off a man and his fire both. The first night under a roof I built, I lay listening to it settle and thought about the first night, when I had no roof and no name for what was happening to me. The hut creaked as it took the night's weight, every groan of the frame a small report that it was holding. Outside the air was thick and waiting. Inside I was dry, on a platform a foot above ground that would have been running water by morning. 7 days from a wet beach to a dry roof. I lay on my back and let the contrast sit. The first night I had been face down on cold sand with a knife and a blanket and 45 seconds of stillness and nothing else. Now there was timber over me that I had cut and raised, a fire banked in a pit I had dug, water I had carried from a pool I had found. The loneliness was still there. It was just no longer the same as helplessness, which is most of what had made it unbearable before. By the 8th morning, the cloud had stopped waiting offshore and started coming in, and I stopped building and started tying things down. The sky had gone the wrong grey, the pressure low enough to feel in my ears, the sea standing up taller than I had seen it. I read it and moved. I heaped rocks from the tide line around every post foot and stake. I weighted the tarp edges. I carried the steel pot, the rations, the thermal blanket, and the ferro rod and kindling in under the roof, out of reach of wind and water, and lashed down everything that could lift and fly. Then I signed in early, while I still could. Streak 8 days. I checked every lashing twice, the way I used to check a manifest twice, and then there was nothing left to check. The sea had gone the color of slate, and the first fat drops came in sideways. I pulled the tarp door closed, put my back to the timber I had cut and raised with my own hands, and waited for the weather to find out whether I had built it well enough. 8 days. I was not going to lose the streak to a storm. I was not going to lose the hut either. The storm came in at dusk, the way the sea always comes for you, all at once, and then more. I watched it build from inside the hut, the clouds I had been tracking for days finally coming in off the water, their edges lit from within by lightning, the wind picking up loose debris and throwing it down the beach ahead of the rain. Then the first drops came in sideways, hard as flung gravel, and a minute after that the deluge was a continuous drumbeat on the tarp, and there was no more watching, only holding. The wind leaned on the timber until the frame groaned. Water found every seam and ran in along the edges of the tarp to pool around my feet. I knelt in the one dry corner with my supplies pulled in close and did the only thing that has ever worked for me in a crisis. I took it one problem at a time. Secure the door flap, then the leaking seam, then the lashing that was working loose on the windward post. Each small task I finished gave me back a square foot of control, and I went looking for the next one. The window opened for the 9th day in the middle of the worst of it, and I understood for the first time exactly what the streak was going to cost me. Daily sign-in available. Sign in now. I was braced against the windward wall with both hands on a tarp edge that wanted to tear free, and signing in meant letting go of it, finding, in a head full of howling wind and cold, and the groan of failing timber, the still clear point from which I could think the one word the window needed. 9 days of not missing. All of it riding on 3 seconds of focus I could barely spare. 3 seconds, I let go of the tarp for 3 seconds and signed in. Streak 9 days. Then I grabbed the tarp again, and the wind tried to take my arm with it, and I held on. Around the worst hour, a corner let go, and I went out into it, because the alternative was losing everything I had built in a week. The lashing on the seaward corner sheared and the tarp peeled back, and rain came straight down into the hut. I took the paracord and the knife and crawled out into the storm, into a dark so total the island had stopped existing past arm's reach, and I relashed the corner by feel, cold fingers, slick rope, knots tied a dozen times, because the wind kept undoing them faster than I could set them. It fought me for what felt like an hour. I beat it by refusing to stop, which is the only way I have ever beaten anything. When the corner held, I fell back inside, soaked through and shaking, the fire long dead. I put my back to a timber I had cut and raised with my own hands and rode out the rest of it, counting under my breath to stay in my own head. 1 hut, 1 streak, 1 man, still here. 1 hut, 1 streak, 1 man, still here. The structure bent and flexed in the gusts and took the water and the wind all night. It bent and it did not break. The storm wore itself out before the light came, the way they do, and I crawled out into a grey calm that felt like the inside of a rung bell. The hut stood, battered but standing. The seaward corner I had fought for hung crooked, half the wall debris was gone, and the whole thing sat lower and meaner than it had the night before, but it stood, and I had been dry enough through the worst night the island had thrown at me. I crawled out into a washed grey dawn that felt as wrung out as I did. The beach was unrecognizable. The storm had thrown the sea's contents up onto the sand overnight, kelp in long black ropes, splintered wood, fresh wrecked debris tumbled in the surf, unfamiliar shapes scattered down the whole curve of the shore. The thing that had nearly killed me had come and gone, the way the first one did, and left me standing in a house I built. I let myself feel the size of that for exactly as long as it took to get my legs under me, and then I started down the beach to see what the storm had brought and what I could use. Halfway down the wrecked beach, I saw a shape that was not debris, because debris does not move, and this moved. It was tangled in a snarl of net and a half-buried life ring, well down toward the waterline, and it was small, and as I stood there it shifted, not the slack roll of something the tide was working, but a movement of its own, weak and deliberate. I had been telling myself for 9 days that I was the only living thing on this island. The shape on the sand moved again, and the thought I had built my whole survival around came apart. Something alive had come in on the storm. I crossed the last of the wet sand at something close to a run, which I had not done since the deck went dark, and dropped to my knees beside it. It was breathing. Whatever it was breathing, and it was the first breathing thing other than me on this whole island, and I was not going to let the storm have it after it had failed to have me. It was a dog. A medium mongrel, soaked black with seawater, ribs heaving, tangled in a snarl of net, and a child's life ring with one paw caught and twisted in the mesh. It was too far gone to be afraid of me. It only rolled one eye up as I dropped down beside it and got to work. I cut it free with the knife, slow and careful around the trapped paw, talking low the whole time the way you talk to a frightened man on a loading dock. Nothing words, steady ones. When the last of the net came away, I got my arms under it and lifted. It was heavier than it looked, dead weight and shivering, and it did not struggle. I carried it up the wrecked beach to the hut, settled it in the dry corner, and went to bring the fire back. I did for the dog what the system had done for me on the first night. I gave it warmth and water, and refused to let the situation be the end of it. I coaxed the dead fire back from its embers with dry kindling from under the tree line, and when it caught I wrapped the dog in the thermal blanket and pulled it against my chest to give it what heat I had. I dripped water into the side of its mouth from the canteen, a little at a time so it wouldn't choke, and I talked to it while I did. It was the first real conversation I had had since the wreck. Just my own voice, low and steady, telling a half-drowned dog that it was all right now, that the worst was behind it, that I had it. The sound of myself saying those things out loud, after 9 days of using my voice only to count, did something to me I wasn't ready to look at directly. The hours went the way the worst hours do, slow and one at a time. The dog's breathing stayed shallow and ragged, and then, somewhere in the middle of the day, it steadied. Its shivering changed from the deep cold kind to the lighter kind that means a body has decided to live. And late in the afternoon, it opened its eyes and looked at me, properly, focused, a dog looking at a man, and I let out a breath I think I had been holding since the beach. When the dog could lift its head, I found the collar under the matted fur, and the tag still had a name on it. I worked it loose with cold fingers and rubbed the muck off the metal tag. A name was stamped on the front, and on the back, a phone number with a country code from one of the islands the Mindoro Star had been crossing between. The name was Sailor. I held the tag a moment longer than I needed to. This was someone's dog, and that someone had been on the Mindoro Star, a passenger who had packed a dog's collar with a phone number on it because they meant to take it home. I did not let myself follow that thought all the way down. I just had the one fact, clean and heavy. The dog had an owner, and the owner was almost certainly somewhere under the same sea that had spat us both back out. I did not say any of it out loud. I just used the name. Sailor, I said. The dog's tail moved once. The system noticed the dog before I had finished deciding what to do about it. I had been turning the rations over in my head, how far they'd stretch for two, what the math was now, when the window opened on its own, the way it had not done since the first night, and added a line in its flat clerk's voice. Camp occupancy updated. 2 provisions will scale accordingly. Streak 9 days. I read it twice and almost laughed. Somewhere behind the window, whatever ran it had registered a second heartbeat in the camp and updated the order, the way a warehouse system flags a change to the headcount on a delivery. Even the system kept inventory. It had no opinion about the dog, no comment, no question. It simply noted that there were 2 of us now and that the boxes would account for it, and went quiet again. I sat with Sailor through the rest of the day. He took a little water, then a little more, then a corner of a ration bar chewed slow and careful, and by dusk he could hold his head up and watch me move around the hut, his eyes following me everywhere, refusing to let me get more than a few feet away. That evening, the dog slept against my side, and I sat very still so as not to wake it, and felt the whole shape of the thing change. For 9 days the build had been about keeping one man alive, and the truth I had not said even to myself was that a man who has stopped wanting things can still survive out of habit. I had been good at the work, and the work had kept me going, and somewhere under it, I had not been entirely sure it mattered whether I made it or not. A man can climb a long way on habit alone. But now there was someone asleep against me who needed the roof to hold, and the streak to continue, and the water to keep coming, and that was a different engine entirely, and a far stronger one. The stakes had stopped being abstract. They were breathing against my ribs. I put another piece of driftwood on the fire and did not move my arm, even after it went numb, because the dog was asleep on it. 9 days. A hut, a streak, a freshwater pool, and now a dog called Sailor who had come in on the same storm that should have finished me. I had built all week to keep one man alive out of habit. I would build the rest of it for something better than habit. I let the fire burn down and watched the dog breathe and did not feel, for the first time in longer than the island had been keeping count, alone. On the 10th morning, I woke to a dog watching me, which beat every alarm I had ever owned. Sailor was up before me, sitting by the cold fire with his head tilted, waiting to see whether I was the kind of thing that woke up. When I stirred, his tail went, brushing a slow arc in the sand. I reached over and scratched behind his ears, and he leaned his whole weight into my hand the way dogs do when they have decided about you. Morning, I told him, and my voice came out rough from sleep and from how little I used it. He thumped his tail again, as if that were a fine thing to have said. Streak 10 days. The streak ticked over in the corner of my eye, and I signed in, and the grey case came down the beach as it always did. I had slept better than I had in years, which I noted with the suspicion of a man who distrusts feeling fine and could find no catch in. 2 mouths is not twice the work of one. It is a different problem, and I had always liked a different problem. I sat with the day's case and did the math out loud, because I had someone to do it at now. Water, rations, the fish I could pull from the lines, the grove I meant to find, split 2 ways, stretched, planned. It was the kind of problem I had spent 11 years being paid to solve, and solving it for 2 felt better than solving it had ever felt for the companies that signed my checks. And the system, in its flat way, had noticed. The day's reward, when I opened it, included something it had never sent before, dried meat in a shape and smell that was plainly not for me. The system had quietly started including food the dog could eat, the clerk behind the window adjusting the order to match the new line on the manifest. I broke a piece off, and Sailor took it from my hand with a delicacy that did not match the speed with which it disappeared. It was the dog that found the food the system hadn't handed me. He had been pulling me off my marked trails all morning, nose down, and I had let him, and a little before noon he led me up into the interior to a place I would not have found on my own, a grove of coconut palms, and under them a low tree heavy with small round fruit. Sailor was already eating windfalls off the ground, so I tried one. It was tart and bright and ran with juice, and after 10 days of sealed rations, it was almost too much. Food that did not come out of a pouch. I sat on a fallen log and ate until my jaw ached, the dog beside me doing the same, and marked the grove in my head against the route home. The water and the fishing the system and I had between us. This the dog had given me free off his own nose, and I noticed the difference. Things I earned or found sat differently in me than things that were handed down. From the top of the rise, I could see the whole island for the first time, and on a ridge across it, there was a straight line where nature does not make straight lines. We had climbed past the grove to the highest ground I had reached, and the island opened out below green canopy, the pale curve of beaches, rock breaking through in places. I was taking the bearing of my own camp, logging it the way I'd log a coordinate, when my eye snagged on the far ridge across the island. A vertical line, then a horizontal one crossing it. Nature does not make straight lines. A broken mast, maybe, the ruin of some old settlement, too far to tell and a hard day's travel to reach. But straight lines meant hands, and hands meant that I might not be the first person this island had held. I filed the bearing and the unease together and turned back down toward camp, because I had a streak and a dog and a roof to mind, and the ridge would keep. I caught myself building for 2 before I had decided to. Streak 11 days. 3 more days to Tier 3. Back at camp that evening, I saw what I had been doing without noticing. A dry corner cleared for the dog, a windbreak set on the seaward side, the doorway widened so he could come and go. I had been planning the place around 2 for days. The build had a beneficiary now, and not just a builder, and the difference showed up in the work before it showed up in my head. I sliced the grove fruit and split it between us on a flat driftwood plank, and Sailor waited for his share with a patience he did not have for anything else, and we ate dinner together in the last of the light, while the streak held at 11 and Tier 3 sat 3 days off. I widened the doorway of the hut that night so the dog could come and go, which is not a thing you do for a place you mean to leave. 11 days. A grove, a dog, a straight line on a far ridge I would get to eventually, and 3 more sign-ins to whatever Tier 3 turned out to be. I had spent 11 years building schedules for things that belonged to other people. I lay down next to something that was starting to belong to me and slept. On the 12th day, I went looking for where my water came from, because a man who has spent his life on supply lines does not rest until he has found the source. Streak 12 days. I signed in early and set out uphill along the trickle with Sailor ranging ahead, tracing the thread of water back through the green interior. It climbed steeper than I expected, winding through brush and over fallen logs, my shirt soaked through within the hour. But a supply line has a source, and I have never been able to leave one unfound. Sailor got there first. His ears went up, his nose dropped, and he darted ahead into a clearing where the light came down in shafts, and when I caught up I found it. A mossy rock face, ferns and lichen, and water coming clean out of the rock into a basin worn into the stone below. I knelt and put my hand in it. Cold, clear, steady, more reliable than the pool downstream, which only existed because of this. For a man whose whole career was the question of where things come from and how they get where they're going, finding the source of my own water was not a small thing. I sat with it a while before I did anything to it. I built the catchment over the rest of that day, and it was the first thing I made that meant I would not die if the window ever stopped opening. I cleared the loose rock from the spring's lip and shaped the basin so it held more before it spilled. I set a small dam of stones and driftwood to steer the overflow into a channel, and below that a settling pool where sediment could drop out before I drew water off clean. I rigged collection vessels from coconut shells and a gourd I'd found in the grove, and ran a tarp off the hut roof down by the camp so the rain would fill a catch bucket too. When it was done, I had water from 3 places: the spring, the catch, the system's daily ration, and a system that meant my water no longer depended on a single delivery. Redundancy, the deepest comfort a logistics man knows. Sailor lay in the shade and supervised, which is to say slept, and bumped my arm with his nose whenever I stopped to look at the work too long. Somewhere around the 13th day, I understood what the system actually was: a head start, not a life. Streak 13 days. Sitting by the finished catchment the next afternoon, watching the level rise on its own, I finally had words for the thing that had been forming since the grove. The system had handed me water and a knife and a streak on the first night, and that had kept me alive. But the catchment I built with my own hands was worth more to me than any of it, because it was mine, and it would keep running whether or not I ever signed in again. That was the difference. A head start, not a life. The window had given me the head start. The life was the part I had to build myself, and I had just built the first load-bearing piece of it. By the evening of the 13th day, the camp looked less like a place I was stuck, and more like a place I lived. I came back down through the grove in the last of the light, Sailor ahead of me on a trail he knew now better than I did, to a camp that had stopped looking like a predicament. The catchment full, driftwood stacked by size, the hut squared away after the storm, a fire I built without thinking about it, a dog who lay down in his place by it without being told. I sat and thought ahead to what self-sufficiency would mean: food I grew, fish I caught, water I no longer counted down. The streak held at 13, and Tier 3 was one sign-in off. One more sign-in to Tier 3. I sat with the dog at the edge of the catchment and listened to the spring run, which it would do whether or not I signed in, whether or not I lived, the most reliable supplier I had ever had. 13 days, water of my own, a roof of my own, a dog of my own, and one more sign-in to whatever came after shelter. For the first time, I was not counting down to rescue. I was counting up to something, and I did not yet have a word for it. On the 14th morning, the window gave me seeds, which was the system's way of telling me to start feeding myself. Sign-in day 14 complete. Streak 14 days. Tier 3 self-sufficiency unlocked. Reward: seed packets, fishing kit, hand pump water filter, garden and hand tools. The crate came down heavier than usual, and when I opened it I understood why. Not provisions, the means to make them, packets of seed, a fishing kit, hooks and line and weights, a hand pump water filter that would do in seconds what my fire did in an hour, a trowel, a hoe, real garden tools. The system had stopped feeding me and started teaching me to feed myself, and the message was about as subtle as a packing slip. Tier 4 comfort unlocks at a 30-day streak. Another rung named on the horizon, 30 days. I filed it and turned to the seeds because comfort was 16 days off and a garden does not plant itself. I planted the garden the way you plant anything you mean to be around to harvest, carefully and for later. I cleared and leveled a plot near the spring where the light was good and the water was close, broke up the soil with the new tools, and laid out rows by eye spacing for growth, room to work between them. I planted the seed at the right depth and watered it in from the filtered catch, and then I stood back and looked at a patch of dirt that would not feed me for weeks. That was the whole point of it. It was the first thing I had done on the island purely for a version of me I now believed would still be here to eat it. You don't plant a garden in a place you are trying to leave. I said it to Sailor, who was lying in the turned earth I'd just smoothed, and he thumped his tail, unrepentant. The fishing took me 2 tries to stop being terrible at, and a third to put dinner on the fire. I set lines off the rocks with the new kit and rigged a simple trap in a channel where the water moved right, and I was bad at all of it for most of a morning. Then a line went tight, and I brought in a fish, small, plump, real, and cleaned it with the fixed blade knife and cooked it over the fire while Sailor sat at a polite and trembling distance. I gave him a piece. We ate a fish I had pulled from the sea with my own hands and my own gear, the island feeding me by my own hand for the first time, not out of a sealed pouch. The window dropped on the sand. It was a small fish. It was a complete change in my standing on the island. 2 weeks in, I needed the window less than I had, and I was fairly sure that had been the point. Streak 14 days. That evening I sat by the fire with a full stomach for the second time in a day and signed in, not out of the desperation of the first nights, but out of discipline and out of respect for a streak I had grown to take seriously. The reward was good. I no longer needed it to live, and that, I was fairly sure, had been the system's design all along, a head start that worked itself out of a job. With water secured and food in the ground and a line in the sea, my mind kept drifting back across the island to the straight line on the far ridge. Now that I was no longer spending every hour staying alive, I could afford to be curious about who had made it. Tomorrow I would go and find out. I banked the fire and looked across the dark island toward the ridge I could no longer see but knew was there, with its one straight line that nature had not made. I had water, food in the ground, a line in the sea, a dog, and 14 days of not missing. I could afford now to be curious. Tomorrow I would go and find out who else this island had held and whether they had been as lucky as me. I already suspected they had not. I signed in at first light on the 15th day and went to find the straight line on the ridge. Streak 15 days. I packed light for a day's travel, water and the filter, rations, the knife, the machete, and set out across the island with Sailor, leaving driftwood markers at every turn the way I'd flag a route I meant to run home in the dark. The straight line had nagged at me for days. Now that I was no longer spending every hour alive, I could afford to go and answer it. The island was bigger on foot than it had looked from the rise, the way everything is bigger when you have to cross it. The interior closed over us, green and close, the canopy breaking the light into moving patches on the floor. Roots caught at my feet, and the heat built under the trees until my shirt was soaked through. We crossed a stretch of open rock, then dense thicket, then a ravine I had to skirt, a deep gash with a stream running fast at the bottom of it, the sides too steep to risk. Sailor ranged ahead and circled back, ahead and back, and the pair of us were strong now in a way we hadn't been a week ago. The island reminded me, about 2/3 of the way across, that it was not only a place that handed out gifts. It came out of the undergrowth without warning, a wild boar, big and bad-tempered, tusks down, squared up and furious at having been disturbed. My heart went into my throat and my hand went to the machete, but I knew, even as I raised it, that I was not going to win a fight with that animal. Sailor decided otherwise about the fighting. The dog put himself between me and it, low and loud, barking with a fury I had not heard from him, hackles up, holding his ground while I backed away slow with the blade up the way you back away from a thing you do not want to turn your back on. The boar pawed and snorted and fainted, and Sailor did not give an inch, and after a long few seconds, the boar decided the noise was not worth the meal and crashed off into the brush. I knelt and put my hands on the dog, who was shaking the way I was shaking. He had put himself between me and a thing that could have killed us both. I had spent 2 weeks learning what the island could give me. In about 10 seconds, I learned what the dog would. It was the dog again that found the first proof, a trail cut by a blade years before mine. Near the base of the ridge, his nose dropped, and he pulled me off our line to it, a path cut into the slope with a blade, long ago, the cuts weathered grey and the trail half grown over, but unmistakably made by a hand. Cut by a blade years before mine. I followed it up, the unease hardening into certainty with every step, and as we climbed the straight line resolved into what it had always been, posts and a collapsed frame. I reached it as the light went, and it was a camp, and no one had lived in it for a long time. A lean-to fallen in on itself, lashed with cord gone to rot, a firing grown over with grass, sun-bleached gear scattered in the undergrowth, rusted cans, a scrap of cloth that had been clothing or bedding once. The bones of a life lived here and ended here. I stood at its edge in the last grey light and knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your head agrees, that someone had been cast away here before me, and that, unlike me, they had no window in the corner of their eye handing them water and a knife, and a streak to keep. I did not go in. The light was gone, and I was not ready, and some thresholds you wait for morning to cross. I made a small fire at the edge of the dead camp, and the dog pressed close, and I sat looking at the shape of a life that had ended on this island without anything to help it. 15 days, the window had been handing me exactly what I needed. Whoever had built this place had been handed nothing at all. In the morning, I would learn what that had cost them, and I already knew it was going to change how I understood my luck. In the morning, I crossed into the camp, and in daylight, it was the record of a man solving every problem I had been handed the answer to. I had slept at the threshold, and I went in with the first real light. In daylight, the camp was worse and better than it had looked at dusk. Worse, because I could see how it had ended. Better, because I could see how hard it had been fought. A lean-to lashed with cord rotted to threads. A firing gone to grass. Fish-drying racks, long empty, still standing. And everywhere, tools improvised from wreckage and bone. Hooks ground from metal scrap. A blade hafted to a length of driftwood. A water STLL rigged from a cracked bottle, and a scrap of sailcloth. Every object in that camp was a problem someone had solved by hand, alone, with nothing, the same problems the window had handed me the answer to on a plate, one morning at a time. I walked through it slow, reading it the way I read a manifest, and what it added up to was a man who had done everything right and lost anyway. His name was Arturo Salcedo, and I learned it from a notebook in a rusted tin. Tin was wedged in the dry crook of the fallen lean-to, and inside it, swollen and faded but readable, was a notebook. Arturo Salcedo, a fisherman lost from his boat, the early pages laid it out plainly in a clear, steady hand. The storm, the boat gone, the swim, the beach, and then the work of staying alive, recorded like an engineer's log. Day 16 made fire from driftwood, diagrams of his traps, sketches of the island's plants annotated, which ones sat well and which ones didn't. And letters. Between the survival entries, there were letters to a daughter he meant to get home to, Marisol, about her birthday, about a Christmas he was sorry to miss. Dear Marisol, if you read this, I love you more than I ever found the words for. He had written them as if the writing would carry, as if a man keeping faith with the people he loved could not, in the end, be allowed to die. I sat on a flat rock with the dog against my leg and read them, and Arturo stopped being a ruin and became a person, stubborn, clever, loving, and completely alone. The entries got shorter the way a man's days do when the island starts winning. Somewhere past the 100th day the log changed. A fall or a fever, he wasn't sure which, and then he was too sick to write much about either. The entries shortened, the detail dropped away, the diagrams stopped. For a stretch there were only dates, and then only tally marks in the margin, one stroke a day, a man counting because counting was the last thing he had the strength to do. Then the marks stopped. There was no dramatic last line. The strokes simply ended on a half-finished page, and the rest of the notebook was blank. He had no rescue and no head start, and no clerk behind a window topping up his water in the night. No window had ever opened for him. He had been exactly as resourceful as me and far braver, and the only difference between his blank pages and my 16-day streak was a thing neither of us would ever be able to explain. I found where Arturo had lain down at the end, and I spent the middle of the day giving him the burial the sea had not. He was in the lean-to, what the years had left of him, and I will not write what that was. I dug a grave with the hand tools in the soft ground above the tide line where the soil was deep enough, and it took me most of the middle of the day. I buried him properly. I laid him facing the water, and I built a cairn over him from the stones of his own firing, and I set one of his small carved markers at the head of it. He had made dozens of them, I never learned for what, and it seemed right that one should finally mark something. The dog sat with me through all of it, quiet, the way he had not been quiet with the boar. I said a few words over the cairn, not a speech. I told him I had read his letters and that I would remember Marisol's name. I told him he had done everything right. Then I stood there a while with my hand on the stones. Two men the same sea had thrown at the same island, and the same sea had taken us both, and spared only one, and there was no reason on earth that the one should have been me. I had spent 16 days thinking of the window as luck. At Arturo's grave I started thinking of it as a debt. Streak 16 days. I signed in at the graveside, and the small ritual that had kept me alive for 16 days felt different with my hands still on Archero's cairn, heavier, and more like a thing I had to earn than a thing I had been given. The window had chosen me and not him, for nothing either of us had done, and the only honest answer I could find to that was to not waste it. To live well, not merely to survive. To be worth the spare. I took his journal to keep. Not as a warning, I had enough warnings, but as a debt I meant to carry. A man who had fought this island with nothing and lost, whose daughter would never know where he ended up, and whose name at least one other person was now going to remember. I put Archero's journal in my pack and built the cairn a little higher before I left, and the dog waited until I was ready and then walked with me. 16 days. A man had fought this island for months with nothing but his hands and his love for a daughter, and lost, and I had been handed water and a knife and a streak on the first night for no reason I would ever know. I owed him a life lived like it was worth being spared for. I went home across the island in the failing light and did not feel lucky. I felt obligated, which is a heavier and a better thing. I carried Archero's journal home across the island and could not stop doing the arithmetic of it. The trek back took the last of the light, the dog ahead of me on a trail he knew now, and the whole way I turned the same sum over and could not make it come out fair. Archero's pages had been full of people. His daughter, Marisol, a wife, I thought, from the way he wrote around her. A whole life on the other side of the water that he had spent his last strength trying to row back to. I tried to do the same accounting for myself, to name the person I was desperate to get back to, and I came up short, and the coming up short was the thing that would not let me sleep that night. I had spent 11 years calling it dedication, and on the island I finally admitted it had been a place to hide. I built the fire up at my own camp and sat with it, and the admission came the way the worst ones do, all at once and long overdue. 11 years of moving other people's cargo across oceans, of being the reliable one, the one who never missed. I had called it dedication, and it had been a hole I climbed into so I would not have to be anywhere else. After our father died, I had stopped calling my brother Marcus, not from a fight. There was no fight, which was almost worse, just a slow letting go, a call not returned and then not made, a birthday missed and then another, work always there to explain it. I had treated my own life like cargo in transit, logged, moved, never opened, handed off at the end of every day to nobody. I said some of it out loud to the dog, because he was the only confessor I had, and it turned out he was a good one. He put his head on my knee while I talked and did not judge a word of it, and there is a particular mercy in confessing to something that loves you and cannot answer back. Archero had died trying to get back to a life he loved. I had spent years walking away from one I had never bothered to live. That was the whole shape of it, laid side by side. He had a wife and a daughter and a home, and he had fought an island for months to get back to them and lost. I had a brother a phone call away and a mother who would have taken the call, and I had let the line go quiet on purpose, because quiet was easier than the work of being a person to anyone. He spent his ending reaching. I had spent my freedom drifting, on purpose, away. The island took him and woke me. There was no justice in it I could find, only the plain, unfair fact of it, and the one thing I could do about it, which was to stop wasting what he never got. On the 17th day, I decided that surviving was not going to be enough, and that was the first decision I had made for myself in a very long time. Streak 17 days. I was not going to merely outlast this island. I was going to live on it, build a real home, not a holdout, and someday, if I ever got the chance, I was going to face the people I had left instead of hiding from them behind an ocean and a job. And then I did a thing I had not done for myself in years. I wrote something. I turned to a blank page at the back of Archero's notebook, dipped a twig in seawater for ink, and started a letter. Dear Marcus. The name alone undid something in me, his laugh, the way he used to call after a bad day and not say anything important, just talk until I came back to myself. I got 2 lines down and stopped, because I did not yet know how to finish a thing I had spent 4 years not starting. But I had started it. The start of a letter to Marcus I did not yet know how to finish. That night I looked at the hut that had kept me alive and saw, for the first time, that it was not enough. It was a good hut. It had held through a storm that should have taken it. But I looked at it now with the decision still warm in me and saw that it was a shelter, and I had just decided to live here, and a life deserves more than a thing you crouch inside until the weather passes. Across the dark island Archeros, Cairn sat over a man who had built exactly that, a holdout, and held it brilliantly right up until it wasn't enough either. A life deserves a home, not a holdout. I started, in my head, to build the cabin I was going to put in its place. I sat with the dog and the unfinished letter and the plan taking shape in my head, the way plans used to take shape when the work still felt like mine. 17 days. A man across the island had fought to get home and lost. I had a home I had been refusing to go back to, and a second one I had not yet bothered to build. I was going to build the second one properly. And someday, if the island ever let me, I was going to finish the letter. The dog sighed and went to sleep, and I stayed up a while longer, designing a house. I went back to Archero's camp once more, not to mourn it, but to inherit it. I signed in, packed for a haul, and crossed the island with Sailor to the dead camp on the ridge. The cairn stood where I'd left it, a little higher than when I'd built it. I stopped at it first. "I'm taking some of your materials," I said to the stones. "For a cabin, good wood shouldn't rot up here when it could be holding a roof up down there." I felt only a little foolish saying it. I told the cairn what I was taking, and why, because it seemed to me that a man's work should be asked for, even when the man is past refusing. Then I salvaged, straight timber that still had years in it, fixings, and the thing I was gladdest to find, a hand-forged blade Archero had hammered out of wreck metal, balanced and keen, and worn smooth at the handle by a hand that was gone. I wrapped it carefully, carrying his work back across the island to raise my own home, turn the grief into something with a use, which is the only thing I have ever known to do with grief. I built the cabin the way I had once wanted to build a life, from a clear plan, with good materials, taking the time to do it right. I laid a stone hearth I laid myself, fitting the stones dry and tight in one corner so I'd have heat and light that didn't depend on an open fire. I raised a proper frame off the platform, Archero's salvaged timber alongside the Tier 3 lumber, his hand-forged blade working beside the system's hammer, the dead man's craft, and the living window's gifts both in my hands at once. I measured every piece against the last. I cut the joints to fit instead of forcing them. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something to a clear plan, with good stock, with no one's deadline on it but my own, and I had forgotten how much I loved the work when the work belonged to me. The days ran together the way good working days do, and for once, I did not mind losing track of them. Streak 27 days. Sign in at dawn, build through the day, fish and tend the garden in the evening, sleep, repeat. The walls went up. A hinged door I hung true, window openings cut and framed. And down by the spring, the garden gave me the garden's first green shoots, a thin, hopeful line of them pushing up out of the turned soil, the first thing I had grown instead of been given, and I crouched over them for a long while like a man reading good news. Sailor thrived through all of it. He'd filled out, his coat had come back, and he supervised the construction with the proprietary suspicion of a foreman who suspects you of cutting corners. I built the dog a bed by the hearth before I built myself one, which told me something about the order of my priorities now. Before I built myself one, before I'd done more than throw my own blanket in a corner, I noticed Sailor was sleeping on the bare floor in the draft from the door, and I stopped what I was doing and built him a raised platform by the hearth, 2 feet up and out of the cold, where the fire's warmth pooled. I sawed it and pegged it and lined it with dry fronds, and when I patted it, he climbed up, turned his 3 circles, and dropped into it with a sigh as if he'd been waiting his whole life for a man to get around to it. I'd built a holdout to keep one man alive. I was building a home to keep something I loved comfortable. The order I'd done those 2 things in told me everything about who I had become out here. By the 28th day, the cabin was nearly a home, and I stood in its doorway and thought about a wet beach a month behind me. Streak 28 days. 2 more sign-ins to Tier 4. Outside, the saplings I'd heeled in were taking, the garden was greening, the spring ran clean down its channel to the catch. I stood in the doorway of a cabin with a hung door and a stone hearth and a dog asleep in his own bed by the fire, and I made myself remember the first morning, face down on wet sand with a gash on my arm and one shoe and a dead phone and nothing else in the world. 28 days between that man and this doorway. I could not always feel the distance, but standing there, I could measure it. I stood in the doorway of the cabin as the light went, the dog leaning on my leg, the garden going to shadow and the spring running somewhere in the dark, and I counted what I had the way I always did, except now the counting took a while. 28 days. A home, a dog, water, food in the ground, a man's grave tended across the island, and 2 more sign-ins to whatever comfort the system thought I had earned. I had built the holdout into a home, and I intended to keep it. The dog went in ahead of me, and I followed it into a house with a door that closed. On the 30th morning, the window stopped handing me things to survive on and started handing me things to live with. Sign-in day 30 complete. Streak 30 days. Tier 4 comfort unlocked. Reward, folding cot, iron stove, solar lantern, books, medical kit, fruit tree saplings. The crates came down heavier than any before, and when I opened them I understood that the window had crossed a line. These were not things to survive on. They were things to live with. A folding cot off the ground for the first time in 30 days, a small iron stove, a solar lantern, a medical kit deeper than anything I'd had, a stack of books, fruit tree saplings, bald and ready to plant. The window had spent a month keeping me alive, and now it had decided I had earned comfort. Tier 5 estate unlocks at a 60-day streak. One more rung, the last one, named on the far horizon, 30 days off. I filed it and got to work making a home out of what I'd been handed. By that evening, I had a stove that drew well, a lantern that did not gutter, and a book, which together make any roof a home. I set the stove against the windward wall and ran its pipe out through a gap I sealed around, and it drew clean on the first light. I hung the lantern from the ridge beam and its panel drank the last of the daylight and gave it back as a steady glow that did not gutter the way a flame does. I made up the cot, shelved the books along a plank, heeled the saplings into good soil by the door, and stowed the medical kit where I could find it in the dark. Then I lit the stove and lay on a real bed and read a book by steady light in a house I had built, with a dog asleep by a stove on an island that a month ago had been trying to kill me. I let myself be happy about it, warily, the way I distrust feeling fine, and could find that night no catch in it. I took the cut-splitting wood for the stove, which is the stupid, ordinary way these things always happen. It was the next afternoon, the last chore of the day, splitting and stacking a store of wood for the stove. I had the rhythm of it, and I got careless at the end of it, the way you do, and the hatchet skipped off a knot and caught me across the shin, a deep, clean gash, more blood than pain at first, the kind of cut that looks worse than it is. I cleaned it and bound it and did not think much of it. I had the new medical kit. I washed it with filtered water, closed it as best I could, wrapped it tight, and finished stacking the wood favoring the leg. I had handled worse on worse days at home and signed for a delivery an hour later. I did not yet know that an island wound is not a mainland wound, and that the same warm, wet air that grew my garden grows other things just as well. The wrongness started as a chill the stove could not reach, and I knew what it was before I unwrapped the dressing. I was reading by the lantern that evening when the cold came up in me, a chill the stove's heat could not touch, and a thickness settled behind my eyes. I put my hand to the dressing on my shin, and it was hot and tight under the wrap. I unwound it, and even by lantern light I could see it, the edges of the gash gone angry and swollen, and red tracking out from the wound in thin lines under the skin, reaching up the leg. I knew what that was. I cleaned it again harder, used what the kit gave me, wrapped it fresh. I told myself it was caught early, but it had moved faster in a day than any infection had a right to, and the dog watched me the way it had watched the storm, close, still, certain something was wrong before I'd admitted it out loud. By the middle of the night, the fever had me, and for the first time in 30 days, I was not sure I could reach the morning's sign-in. It came up fast and hard. By the small hours I was burning, shivering, the cabin tilting when I turned my head, lucid in patches and gone in between. And in one of the lucid patches, the arithmetic arrived, cold and clear through the heat. The next sign-in window opened at dawn, and signing in took a clear thought I could feel myself losing, and a missed day reset everything. 30 days of discipline, the tears, the climb, and more than that, I was genuinely, dangerously sick on an island with no one to help me but a dog. The streak in my life had become the same problem. Keep the one and I might keep the other. Lose the thread of myself before dawn and I might lose both. I put the medical kit and the water within reach of the cot and banked the stove so it would last, and the dog climbed up and lay against me, too warm against a fever, but I did not have the heart or the strength to move him. 30 days I had not missed. The window would open at dawn, a few hours off, and I was burning, and I was not sure I would be lucid enough to think the one word it needed. I held onto the dog and the count and the dark, and waited to find out whether 30 days of not missing was about to end on the floor of a house I had built to live in. I came up out of the fever at dawn on the 31st day with one clear thought floating in all the wool. The window was about to open. The first grey light came through the cabin seams. I was sicker than I had ever been, the room tilting when I moved my eyes, the wound a hot line of fire up the leg, my head packed with cotton. I was flat on the cot under the blanket, soaked through with sweat, and somewhere in the wool was the one fact that mattered. In a little while the window would open, and 30 days rode on a single clear thought I was no longer sure I could produce. The window opened, and I reached for the one word it needed, and the fever kept taking it away from me. Daily sign-in available, sign in now. I found the prompt and reached for yes, and the fever closed over the word before I could think it. I surfaced and reached again and went under again. The window hung there, patient, indifferent to the fact that I was losing the thread of my own mind in front of it, and each time I grasped for the thought, the heat dissolved it. And then Sailor saved the streak. He had been pressed against my side, and when I went slack he knew it before I did, first a whine, then a bark sharp and close enough to hurt, and when that didn't hold me, he shoved his cold nose hard into the hollow of my hand and pawed at my chest, scrabbling, insistent, refusing to let me sink. The noise and the cold of his nose and the weight of him hauled me up out of the heat the way a hand hauls you up out of deep water into one narrow window of clarity. In that window, with the dog's whole front pressed to my chest and his eyes on mine, I held the word still long enough to think it. Yes. Streak 31 days. The streak logged. I fell back shaking, and the dog put his head on my chest, and I understood even through the fever that I had not done that. It was the dog that brought me back to the surface in time. The reward came with what I needed, the way it always had, the way it never had for the man across the island. The Day 31 case had come down on the sand outside, and in a later patch of clarity, I got to it on my hands and knees and dragged it in. Inside, on top of the rations and the water, was the thing it never handed: Archero, antibiotics, and clean dressings, on top of the medical kit from the day before. I did the most important first aid of my life on myself, one-handed and shaking. I dry swallowed the antibiotics. I unwrapped the shin, cleaned the angry wound again with what the kit gave me, gritted through the sting of it, and bound it fresh. I forced down water in small sips because a body cooking itself needs water more than anything. It was clumsy and slow and frightening, and the system had, again, set exactly what would save me within reach of a man it had every reason to let die, for no reason I would ever be given. The worst of it was a long day I only remember in pieces, and in every piece the dog was there. I went under and surfaced and went under. The fever ran its films behind my eyes, the deck of the Mindoro Star tilting and the lights going out and the cold coming in, Archero's tally marks marching down a margin and stopping, my brother Marcus's face, the way he looked the last time I saw him before I let the line go quiet, the unfinished letter, the cold water, the dark. And in every piece, the dog. Sailor did not leave the cot. Whenever I slid too far down, he nudged me back. A whine, a cold nose, my groggy answer, another sip of water, another pill counted out with fingers that didn't feel like mine. The thermometer from the kit read a number I didn't like. I held to the count and the water and the warm weight of the animal against my ribs, and I did not let go of any of the three. The fever broke toward dawn the way a storm does, all at once, and into a strange, clean calm. The heat let go between one breath and the next, near the second dawn, and I came up out of it weak and soaked and clear and alive. The wound throbbed, but the red lines had stopped climbing. The cotton was gone from my head. I lay still and took inventory of myself the way I take inventory of everything, one body, battered, fevered, holding, and found, against the odds and the splinter of wood that had nearly ended me, that the Count came out alive. Sailor was still on the cot, exhausted, having stood a watch he'd had no orders to stand. The dog had kept me alive. He had roused me for the sign-in when I could not have done it alone, and he had stayed through the dark when leaving would have cost him nothing. The dog was still on the cot, exhausted in the way of something that has not let itself sleep, and when I put my hand on him, he thumped his tail once against the blanket and finally closed his eyes. He had nudged me back to the surface in time to sign in, and he had stayed through the dark. I had owed Archero a life lived well. I owed the dog a more immediate thing, to get up off this cot and be worth the watch he had kept. 31 days. I had nearly lost all of it to a splinter of wood, and a dog had not let me. I lay still and let him sleep and felt, under the weakness, something I had spent 11 years making sure I never felt, looked after. For 3 days, I was weak as water, and for the first time in my life, I let myself be. I did almost nothing. I lay on the cot, and I slept, and I made myself thin broth on the iron stove from rations, and the few greens I'd learned were safe, and I drank it slow. Sailor never went far. He'd lie against the cot with his chin on my arm and lift his head whenever I stirred, and when I tried to get up too soon and do too much, he would get up too and stand in the doorway as if to make leaving the harder option. I had spent my whole adult life refusing to be looked after, being the reliable one, the one who managed, the one who never needed the call returned. The fever and the dog had taken that choice out of my hands, and lying there letting a dog mind me while my body knit itself back together, I found, to my surprise, that being cared for did not diminish me. It had only ever frightened me. There is a difference, and it took an island and a near thing to teach it to me. I owed the dog the way you owe the person who pulls you out of the water, which is to say completely and without resentment. I sat with what had happened, once I was clear enough to sit with anything. Sailor had roused me to make the sign-in when I could not have made it alone, and stood watch through the worst of the dark. Without him, I would have slid under and missed the window and very probably not woken up at all. He was not company anymore, not only. He was the reason I was alive, plainly and without exaggeration, and the debt ran both ways now and would for the rest of whatever life he had bought me. I made him a promise, sitting there with my hand in his fur, not out loud, but I meant it as much as anything I have ever meant, that the life he had saved would be worth the saving. It was during the recovery week that the window showed me the shape of the last thing it was offering. Streak 38 days. I had kept signing in through the fever days, the ritual reduced to its bones, and on one of the recovery mornings, the window gave me something more than the day's provisions, the shape of the last rung. Sign-in day 38 complete. Tier 5 estate, final tier, unlocks at a 60-day streak. Reward, workshop, milled lumber, hardware, water and power systems, fittings. A workshop, milled lumber, water and power. The window had stopped talking about shelter and started talking about an estate, the last and largest thing it had to offer, the one that would turn a homestead into something a person could live a whole life inside. I stood in the door of my cabin and looked at the cleared, planted, watered ground I'd made and understood that I could build something genuinely good here and that I wanted to. 22 days off, close enough to plan for. By the end of the week, the wound was a scar, and I was a man who wanted, plainly and without apology, to live. The leg healed, the red went out of it, the swelling dropped, and the gash closed a pink seam that pulled when I bent it and would fade. I tested it splitting a little wood, careful, and the body answered. And under the returning strength was a thing the fever had burned clean and clear. I wanted to live. Not out of habit, not out of the streak's momentum, not because the work filled the hours. I wanted it, because for the first time I had a life I would be sorry to lose. The island could still kill me. The fever had proved that past arguing. And I found I minded the thought of dying now in a way the numb man on the first beach never would have. Recovered and resolved, I looked at my clearing and decided to spend the next 20 days building the best version of the life the island had let me keep. Streak 38 days. I stood in the middle of what I'd made, the cabin with its stove and its hung door, the garden greening, the spring running clean down its channel, the dog asleep in the sun, and I made a plan, not a survival plan, a builder's plan, the kind I used to draw for other people's warehouses and never once for myself. The estate the window had named, cited and sequenced, every piece in an order that made sense. Workshop here, water gravity-fed from there, the dock at the cove. I drew it out in my head with a pleasure I had not let myself feel about my own life in a decade, and then I started in on the parts I could begin before Tier 5 ever landed. I stood in the clearing with the dog and the garden and the spring and the cabin I had built, and I made the plan the way I used to make plans before the work stopped being mine, completely and with pleasure. 38 days, 22 to the last tier, and a clearing that was already more than Archero had ever been given the chance to build. I was going to make the rest of it worthy of the man who never got the chance and the dog who made sure I would. I picked up the saw, favoring the healed leg out of habit more than need, and got back to work. I broke ground on the estate the way I had once drawn warehouse plans I never got to build, for myself, finally and properly. Over the back half of the recovery, with the leg sound again, I started the estate proper, sited the workshop, marked an extension off the cabin, laid the whole homestead out in driftwood stakes, the way I'd once laid out a floor plan for a distribution center I'd never get to walk. The difference was that this one was mine. I worked Archero's tools alongside the systems, the dead man's rough, hand-forged blades, and the window's clean new steel both in my hands at once. And between the two of them, there was nothing on that island I couldn't cut, drive, or join. I built a dock at the cove, which is an odd thing to build when no boat is coming, and built it anyway because a place that means to last needs a way to meet the water. It took the better part of a week. I drove pilings into the cove bed, chopped and split and sank them, lashed and braced them, and decked them over plank by plank until the dock reached out past the shallows. It was hard, cold, satisfying waterwork, and there was no practical reason for it, no boat was coming. But a homestead that means to last needs a way to meet the water, and I had spent 40 days at the sea's mercy. Standing at the end of a dock I'd built, looking out at the water that had tried to kill me, I felt for the first time not fear, but a kind of even footing, a way to meet the water. Water and power are what turn a shelter into a place you live, and over a week I gave the estate both. Reward crates through that stretch came stocked for it, solar panels, a battery, wire and conduit, a lighting kit, the parts for a gravity tank and a proper filter. I piped the spring down to a header tank above the cabin, ran it through the filter, and brought it into a basin inside, so that clean water came to me instead of the other way around. I set the panels where they'd drink the most sun, wired the battery to a lighting kit, and gutted an old salvage lantern to take a switched electric bulb. The night I first had running water and light at the flick of a switch, I stood in the middle of the cabin and laughed out loud, alone, because after months of carrying water and coaxing flame, the small miracle of a tap and a switch was almost too much. Sailor watched me from his bed by the stove with the narrow suspicion of a foreman who thinks the boss has lost the thread, and then went back to sleep. I walked down to the stretch of sand where I had washed up with nothing. On the night I promised myself I would make this beach unrecognizable. Near the end of the build season, I went down to it on purpose, the exact stretch of sand where I had woken face down with nothing, one shoe and a dead phone and a gash on my arm. I made myself stand on the spot and look at what was there now, a dock reaching into the cove, a path up through cleared green to a cabin with light in its windows and water running inside it, a workshop, a garden in rows, a water system, a power system, a dog trotting the grounds like he held the deed. On the first night I had promised myself, with nothing in my hands, that I would make this beach unrecognizable. I stood on the spot 2 months later and let it land that I had made this beach unrecognizable, and that the man who'd made the promise and the man keeping it were not quite the same man, and that this was the whole point. It was in the last of the build season that I got the radio working, and the world I had left came back into the room with me. Streak 55 days. Among Archero's salvage and a tier rewards components, I found the makings of a hand-crank emergency radio, and one evening I sat down and got it working. Fresh cells, a splice, the insulation taped, the case dried out and closed. I cranked the handle until the gears caught and the dial woke with a crackle of static, and I worked the tuning slow, not really believing anything would answer. Something did. Under the static, far off and faint, a voice, a person talking to another person about something ordinary, somewhere out past the horizon where the Mindoro Star had been trying to go. Not a distress channel, not rescue, just the world still turning, still full of people having small conversations, exactly where I had left it. I did not transmit, I only listened. I listened until the voice faded back into static, and I sat with the radio in my lap, in the lit window of a house I had built, and felt something I had kept carefully shut for 2 months crack open. The world was still out there. The people in it were still in it. I cranked the radio until my arm ached and held it to my ear, and under the static there was a voice, too far off to make out, talking to someone about something ordinary, somewhere the Mindoro Star had been trying to reach. I listened until it faded, and then I set the radio on the workshop bench and sat in the lit window of a house I had built, with a dog asleep by the stove, and did not know what I felt. 55 days. The estate was nearly finished, the last Tier 5 sign-ins off, and the world had just put its hand on my shoulder for the first time since the sea took everything. I had spent the whole island not thinking about the people I left. The radio was going to make me think about them now. I learned from the radio that I was dead. I had taken to listening in the evenings, cranking the set and walking the dial, piecing the world back together a fragment at a time. And on the 56th night I caught it, a report, a maritime bulletin, something with the cadence of an anniversary item. The ferry Mindoro Star, lost with all aboard, 2 months gone, presumed sunk with no survivors, lost with all aboard. The phrase included me. I sat very still on the workshop bench with the radio in my lap. If the Mindoro Star was lost with all aboard, then to everyone on the other side of that water I was dead. Marcus and our mother had buried me. The brother I had stopped calling, and the mother whose calls I had let go to silence had grieved me, held some kind of service for me, learned to say my name in the past tense. And I was sitting in a lit cabin I'd built with my own hands, alive, eating fish I'd caught, while they carried the weight of a death that hadn't happened. It gutted me in a way the island never had. The island had only ever tried to kill my body. This had got at something else. On the 57th day, I saw a sail on the horizon, the first ship since the one that sank under me. It was out past the reef when I came down to the dock in the morning, small with distance but unmistakable, a vessel, hull and upperworks, tracking slow across the far water. The first ship I had seen since the one that went down under me. I stood on the end of my own dock and watched it, and a dozen things happened in my chest at once. A ship on the horizon meant the world was reachable. It meant rescue was no longer a fantasy I'd given up on, but a thing moving across the actual sea in front of me. It meant I could go home and end my family's grief and stop being a dead man if I could make it see me. I stood on my own dock and discovered that I did not want to be rescued, and that not wanting it was not the same as it being right. That was the part that stopped me. Standing there with a real ship in view, I checked myself for the leap of hope a castaway is supposed to feel, and found instead that I did not want to go. I had a home here, a dog, a garden, a workshop, a dock under my feet that I'd built, the first life that had ever felt like mine, and it was on this island. But not wanting to be rescued was not the same as it being right, because there were the people I had abandoned, first by drifting on purpose for years, and now by being dead to them when I was not. A man who had spent a whole island learning to stop hiding from his own life could not, in good conscience, keep hiding from theirs. The home I'd made and the people I'd left were both real, and they were pulling in opposite directions, and a passing ship had just made the question urgent. Streak 57 days. I built the means to be found and then did not use them, because I had learned on this island to act on decisions and not on impulses. I did not run down the beach waving at a ship that couldn't have seen me anyway. Instead, I built the means deliberately so the choice would be mine to make with a clear head and not lunge it out of guilt. On the headland with the best sightline, I stacked a great signal beacon, driftwood and dry brush piled high, kindling tucked at its base, a fire I could put a spark to in seconds, and that would throw smoke a ship could read for miles. I left it unlit. And I confirmed what I'd half known since I got the set working. The radio could transmit, not just receive. The signal meter held steady when I keyed it, even if I sent nothing. Then I stepped back from both. The means were ready. I did not use them. 2 months of never missing a sign-in had taught me, if nothing else, to act on decisions and not on impulses, and this was a decision I was not going to make by flinching at a sail. The sail went over the horizon, and the weather came up behind it, the way it had the first time, and I knew the choice was not going to wait for a calm day. By dusk, the ship had gone over the horizon, and behind where it had been the sky was doing what it had done before the first storm, the pressure dropping into my joints, the sea building, the light going wrong. Weather was coming, big weather, and on the radio that evening I caught traffic from a vessel working the waters near the island, closer than the one that had passed. The unlit beacon stood cold on the headland. The unfinished letter to Marcus was in my pocket where it had lived for weeks. And I understood, reading the sky, that the choice I had wanted to make with a clear head on a calm day was not going to be given a calm day. I put the unfinished letter in my pocket and looked from the unlit beacon on the headland to the slate-colored sky coming in off the water. 57 days. A ship had passed, and another was out there in the dark, and a storm was coming the way the first one had, and somewhere across the sea 2 people I loved thought I was at the bottom of it. I had built the means to end that. I had 3 days to the last tier and no idea, standing on my own dock in the rising wind, whether I was going to light the fire or let it stand cold. The dog leaned against my leg, and we watched the weather come. The second storm was bigger than the first, and it brought a ship with it. It came in off the same quarter as the one that had wrecked me, taller and blacker, and I battened the estate down against it, but it was a different act than Night 8 had been. Then I had been scrambling to save a flimsy hut in a panic. Now I shuttered windows I had glazed, weighted a roof I had built to hold, and brought the saplings and the loose gear in through a door that latched. Routine, competence, a man securing a home he trusted. And on the radio, through the rising static, the thing that turned the storm into a decision, a vessel, close, working the waters off the island, near enough that its calls came through almost clear. Near enough that if I lit the headland beacon and keyed the mic now, it might actually come for me. The choice came down to seconds at the door of a house I had built, with the storm screaming and the means to be rescued 1 dangerous run away. The beacon was on the headland, across open ground, in the teeth of a storm that was already throwing branches. To light it, I would have to leave the estate and the dog, run exposed through the worst of it, and gamble my life on raising a ship I wasn't even sure I wanted to raise to end my family's grief. The means to be rescued were 1 dangerous run away. I stood at the latch door with my hand on it, and the storm screaming on the other side, and the dog at my feet looking up at me, and I had seconds, not hours, to choose. I shut the door. I did not run for the beacon. I looked at the headland through the rain, open ground, the full weight of the storm across it, a beacon that might or might not raise a hull that might or might not turn, and then I looked down at the dog leaning hard against my leg, and back at the lit room behind me that I had built board by board, and I made the choice with my whole body before my head had finished arguing. I shut the door against the storm and stayed, with the estate, with the dog, with the life I had built, and let the rescue window close. I felt it close. I did not reach for it, and in the choosing, the thing I could not decide on the dock in the calm came clear. I did want my brother and my mother back, but I was not going to be torn off this island in the dark, abandoning everything I'd made and the animal that had kept me alive, lunging at a passing hull out of guilt. I would reach out on my own terms, not be torn off the island in the dark, when the weather was clear and my hand was steady, and the choice was a decision and not a flinch. It was a hard right choice, and it sat in my chest as both grief and relief, which is how you know that kind of choice when you make it. I had ridden out a storm in a torn hut on the 9th night, fighting for every lashing. On the 59th, I rode one out in a house that did not need my help. Streak 59 days. The contrast was the whole measure of the distance I'd come. On the 9th night, I had gone out into the dark to relash a corner with frozen fingers because losing it meant losing everything. On the 59th, I sat by the iron stove with a book I wasn't reading and a dog asleep at my feet while the estate took the storm without me. The joints held, the roof held, the water in it stayed where I'd put it. And when the day's window opened mid-storm, the sign-in that had nearly killed me at day 9 was a practice thing now, 30 seconds, done without setting down my cup. I rode out the worst night the island had thrown since the first one, dry and warm, in a house that did not need me to fight for its life, and the not fighting was its own strange grief, for the man on the 9th night who'd had to. The storm wore out by dawn and took the ship and the rescue with it, and the beacon stood cold on the headland exactly where I had left it. By first light it had blown through. The estate stood barely marked. The garden had taken a beating it would shrug off, and the vessel that had been close in the night was gone, off the radio, over the horizon, the rescue window closed with it. The beacon stood cold on the headland, unlit, exactly where I had left it by choice. I walked up to it in the washed light to be sure of how I felt, and what I felt was clean, no regret. I had let a ship pass to keep a house and a dog and a life, and I would have made the same call on a calm day, which was the test of it. Tomorrow was the 60th day, the last tier, and the day after that, on a clear morning with a steady hand, I was going to do the thing I had refused to do in a panic, pick up the radio and tell the world I was alive, on my own terms. I walked up to the headland in the washed dawn light and put my hand on the cold, unlit beacon and felt no regret in it at all. 59 days. I had let a ship pass to keep a house and a dog and a life, and I would have made the same choice in calm weather, which was how I knew it was the right one. Tomorrow was the last tier. The day after that, on a clear morning with a steady hand, I was going to pick up the radio and stop being a dead man to my brother. The dog came up the headland and sat beside me, and we watched the empty horizon, and for once, the emptiness did not feel like a verdict. On the 60th morning, calm after the storm, the window paid out the last of everything it had promised. The sea was flat and bright the morning after the decision storm, the air washed clean, and when I signed in the window, did the thing it had been climbing toward for 2 months. Sign in day 60 complete. Streak 60 days. Tier 5 estate unlocked final tier. Reward, milled lumber, glazing, finished door and hardware, fittings, comforts. The largest delivery of all of it came down, milled lumber dressed and true, real glazing for the window openings I'd left rough, a finished door with proper hinges and a lock, hardwood for the floor, fittings and small comforts I'd stopped letting myself think about. 60 days of not missing, paid out in full, in the one currency the island dealt in. I crouched by the stack and read the labels and saw the finished house in it before I'd lifted a board. I finished the estate that day, and standing inside it, I understood that luxury, when you have built it yourself out of a wrecked beginning, is just the word for a place that is wholly and finally yours. I worked through the day and into the evening and I finished it. The glazed windows went into their openings and let the light in without the weather. The finished door hung true and shut with a sound I felt in my chest, a lock that turned. The hardwood went down over the platform plank by plank, tight, no gaps. The last fittings, the small comforts, the things that turn a sturdy box into a place a person lives. It was not opulent. It was not the mansion the word luxury puts in your head. It was a fine, warm, well-made home on a green clearing above a cove, built by one man's hands out of a wrecked beginning, and standing inside it finished, I understood that luxury is just the word for a place that is wholly and finally yours. I had built every joint of it. No one had given it to me but the days, and I had earned the days. I had spent 11 years making sure I wanted nothing, because a man who wants nothing cannot lose anything. That was the engine of the whole life I'd left, wanting nothing, on purpose, because the numb safety of wanting nothing is that it can't be taken from you. I had built a fortress out of not caring and called it dedication and lived inside it for a decade. And I stood in the doorway of a home I had wanted and planned and built, with a garden I'd planted and a dog I loved asleep in the sun and a man's grave I tended across the island, and I let myself want it and have it without flinching. I thought of Archero, who had wanted desperately and never got the chance. I thought of the dog who had made sure I took mine. And I let myself, for the first time in longer than I could account for, simply want the thing I was looking at and be glad it was mine. The sign-in had stopped being survival somewhere around the day I planted the garden, and become something closer to a prayer I did not skip. Sailor came and leaned against my leg in the doorway, and I scratched his ears and thought about the window. I did not need it anymore. I had water of my own, food of my own, power and a filter, and a sea full of fish and a garden coming in. If the window never opened again, I would live. The sign-in had stopped being survival weeks ago. But I kept it, and I knew I would keep it, because it had become a discipline of gratitude, a small daily acknowledgement of the luck I'd been handed and the debt I owed for it, a thing I did each morning the way some people pray, not because skipping it would end me, but because doing it was who I had become. The system stayed what it had always been, plain, faithful, faintly bureaucratic, its origin unknown and for now unimportant. It had never told me why me and not Archero. I had stopped needing it too. That evening, I sat in the lit window of a finished house and felt, for the first time I could remember, like a whole thing rather than a man in transit. Streak 60 days. The light went soft and gold and then blue. Sailor curled up by the stove. I sat in the window of a finished house, electric light steady overhead, the garden going to shadow outside, the spring running somewhere in the dark, and took the kind of inventory I had never once taken of my own life before the wreck. Not what I'd lost, but what I had and what I was. And the count came out for the first time I could remember whole, not a man passing through, not cargo in transit. A whole thing in a place that was his. There was the radio on the bench with the unfinished letter beside it, and I looked at the two of them a long time. There was one thing left to do, and it was not a thing the island could hand me or take away, and I was not going to do it tonight, in the dark, on a feeling. I was going to do it tomorrow, in the clear morning light, the way I now did everything that mattered. I sat in the window a long time with the dog asleep by the stove and the radio quiet on the bench and the letter to my brother beside it, no longer unfinishable, only unfinished. 60 days from a wet beach with nothing to a lit house I had built with my own hands, and a streak I kept now for gratitude instead of survival. There was one thing left, and it was not a thing the island could hand me or take away. Tomorrow, on a calm, clear morning, I was going to pick up the radio and finish the letter and stop being a dead man to the people I loved. The estate could wait. It was, finally, going nowhere, and neither was I. On a calm, clear morning, I finished the letter to my brother, and it turned out I had known what to say all along. I had only needed to become a man who would say it. Day 61 came up calm and clear, the way I'd asked it to. I sat at the table in the finished house with the morning light coming clean through the new glazing, and I took out the letter I'd started in the back of Archero's notebook weeks ago and never known how to finish, and I finished it. It turned out I had known the words all along. I had only needed to become a man who would say them. Dear Marcus, I'm alive. I let those two facts sit on the line by themselves because they were the whole of it. Then the rest came easy. I'm sorry for the years of silence, the calls I didn't return, the distance I let grow because distance was easier than being a person to anyone. Dad dying was no excuse, and I used it as one for too long. I got wrecked on an island, and it took losing everything to teach me what I'd been throwing away with both hands. I built a life out here. I'd like you in it. Come and see what I made. I read it once and did not change a word. It was honest and direct, in my own voice, the first wholly true thing I had said to my brother in 4 years. I carried the radio out past the cold beacon to the headland, and for the first time, I transmitted. I walked up to the headland with the radio and the dog, past the great unlit beacon I had chosen not to light in the storm, and I sat down with the sea spread out calm in front of me and keyed the mic. It took a while. I worked the frequencies the way Archero had worked his traps, patiently, and on some attempt I lost count of, a voice came back through the static, a coast station, or a vessel standing by, I never knew which. I gave my name and said that I was alive. Daniel Reyes, I told them, off the ferry Mindoro Star, 2 months lost, alive and well on an uncharted island, and would they please pass word to my family that I had not gone down with the ship. The voice read it back to me, calm and certain, and said the message would be relayed. Somewhere on the other side of the water, a thing was set in motion that would end a funeral. I did not ask to be taken off. I thanked them, and I signed off, and I sat on the headland with my hand on the dog and let the years of grief, theirs and mine, start, finally, to recede. I had run from my life by drifting. Now I stayed in one by choosing, and the difference between the two was the whole distance I had come. Because I was staying, I knew it as I walked back down from the headland. Before the wreck, I had left my life by drifting out of it, a degree at a time, until there was nothing left to leave. Now I was staying in one on purpose, with my eyes open, having told the people I loved exactly where I was and that I loved them, and that was the opposite of hiding, even though from the outside it might look like the same man alone on the same island. The door was open both ways now. I could leave when I chose. They could come when they chose. The world knew I was here. For the first time in my adult life, I was not a man in transit, logged and moved and never opened. I was a man with an address, and I had built it myself, and I meant to live there. I never did learn what the window was, or why it had chosen me and not the man whose grave I tended, and I had made my peace with the not knowing. Sign in, day 61 complete. I signed in that evening the way I would keep signing in, not for survival, but for gratitude. And the window, which had been a flat clock for 60 days, which had never once said a word more than its function required, added something it had never added before. Streak 61 days. Welcome home, survivor. It had never said that before. Welcome, survivor, it had said on the first night, on a wet beach, to a dead man it had decided to keep. Welcome home, it said now, to a man in a house he had built. I sat with the two greetings a long moment, 61 days apart, and did not try to solve them. I never learned what the window was, or why it chose me and not Archero, and I had made my peace with the not knowing. But I noticed the word it had chosen, and I let it stand, and I did not feel, reading it, that I was talking to a vending machine. I walked down in the evening to the stretch of sand where I had woken with nothing, and stood where the first morning had found me, and looked at the horizon. Behind me up the path, the dock, the lit windows of the house, the garden, the workshop, the spring running in the dark. Beside me, sailor, grown strong and glossy, leaning his weight against my leg the way he had since the storm gave him to me. And in front of me the horizon, the same line that had brought the wreck and the storms and the dog and the sail, the line I had searched for rescue and then chosen not to signal. It was not a verdict anymore. It was not a threat. It was just the horizon, with the world on the far side of it now knowing my name and that I was alive, and I could look at it now without fear. The beach was unrecognizable, the way I had promised it would be on the first night, when I had a knife and a blanket and 45 seconds of stillness and nothing else. 61 days. A dock, a path, a lit house, a garden, a grave I tended across the island, a dog asleep on a bed I built him by the stove, and a brother across the water who knew now that I was alive. The countdown ticked quietly in the corner of my eye toward tomorrow's sign-in, which I would not miss, because I never missed it, because it was who I had become. I stood where I had washed up with nothing and looked at the horizon that had taken everything and then, in its strange and unaccountable way, given me back more than it took. The tide came in and went out and did not touch me. I went up the path to the light in the windows, and the dog came with me, and we went home.